My name is Chris Thorogood. I'm an author, an illustrator, and the Deputy Director and Head of Science at the University of Oxford Botanic Garden. And it's my pleasure today to take you on a weird plant safari. Today we're going to look at the weird side of plants, a dark world, a world in which plants trick, trap, and even kill. This is a talk about the evolution of killer plants. Today we're going to look at vampires, the plants that suck the sap out of the roots of other plants. We'll look at killers, the plants that evolved various traps to snare, kill and digest animal prey. Fraudsters, plants that pretend to be something they're not. Jailers, plants that actually have evolved prison cells for insects. We'll then touch upon the softer side of the plant world with the accomplices, the plants that work a little more collaboratively with animals. And then we're going to talk about survivors, because this is where plants really turn the tables on animals in terms of how they can survive in adverse conditions. And then the hitchhikers, so the ingenious ways that plants get around, plants move from A to B. First, a little bit about what it means to be a botanist. I really love my job. I'm so lucky to work with plants, and I've always wanted to ever since I was a kid. I used to grow all sorts of unusual things on my bedroom windowsill, and I used to love to paint them, which I'll come on to in a moment. And today I'm very fortunate that I get to go to all sorts of interesting places around the world, some of them quite scary in fact. So on the show you a cliff top that I was dangling from a few weeks ago in the Canary Islands off the north coast of Africa. A really beautiful view. These are some of the wonderful places that plants literally hang on for dear life. They're places where plants have remained undisturbed by humans for such a long time that they've survived there. And it's also taken me to interesting places in the Middle East, like this minefield here. Again, places that are often undisturbed and people don't go to, where some of the most interesting plants can grow. And to many beautiful places as well. And I've seen some beautiful plants in some wonderful places around the world. And it gives me such great pleasure to come home and try to recreate some of that magic that I've seen using oil paints on canvas. As I mentioned a moment ago, I've always been fascinated by plants and I've always grown them. And I remember as a little kid sitting on my bedroom floor illustrating and painting plants, and really not much has changed. Once I've seen wonderful plants in their beautiful settings, I have this burning desire to come home and recreate on canvas, conjure up what I've seen, whether it's a misty hillside in Borneo or a desert in Africa. And to bring those plants to life. There's nothing I love more than that. And so today in this weird plant safari that I'm taking you on, I'll show you some of the plants that I've been fortunate enough to see and then have illustrated when I've got home from my travels. As I say, this is something I've always loved to do, and recently I was going through some old files and I found some doodles I did from when I was small, a teenager actually, looking at the date here. These are some pen and ink drawings that I did for a local national newspaper. And so it's something that has been a passion that I've carried with me my whole life, and I still love to paint today. This is a painting of a pitcher plant that I produced, Nepenthes burbidgii. It's one that I painted recently. It's called the porcelain pitcher plant. It produces these gorgeous creamy white pitchers, and I was lucky enough to see this on Borneo. You can see how messy my hand is there, covered in paint. Now, before I show some of the weird plants, some of the plants that you'll see may look fictional. And I wanted to start with a screaming mandrake. And whenever I mention mandrakes to people, they often think that this is something that's been conjured up because it features in Harry Potter. But a mandrake is actually a real plant, and we grow them here at Oxford Botanic Garden. And this is a plant that was once believed to be magical, because if you were to dig one up, it has a root slightly shaped in the form of a human figure, a bit more like a sort of giant distended parsnip, I think it looks like to me. But it's vaguely anthropomorphic, so human shaped. And it also has potent chemical properties. So it's a narcotic, it induces sleep, and was once used as a makeshift anesthetic. And so the combination of its potent chemistry, it's packed full of chemicals that have quite an impact on the human physiology, combined with how this plant looked, meant that it was revered and it was very valuable. And it was actually believed that if you were to dig one up, the mandrake would scream, and that if you heard this scream, the evil demon would have been transferred from the root into the human. And so it was believed that the only way to harvest a mandrake safely was to tether it to a dog. And that way, as the dog hoisted it out of the soil, the demon will be transferred to the dog and not to the person. I just wanted to start with that interesting snippet of folklore before I show you some other that are indeed real. Here you can see a real mandrake on the left that I saw flowering in Sicily. So let's start off with vampires, the parasitic plants, the plant pilferers of the plant world. These are plants that lack chlorophyll and photosynthesis, so forget what we learnt in our textbooks at school, because these plants have an altogether more sinister lifestyle. They don't manufacture their own food, they steal it. So many of them attach to the roots of other plants. Here are some examples that I've seen on my travels, and I'll show you some even more impressive ones. These ones are called broom rapes on the left, and on the right is a close relative called Cistanchi. Very, very peculiar plants. This one on the left is growing on some sand dunes in Portugal, and the one on the right was seen in around the areas of Israel and Palestine in the deserts there. As you can see, they've got no green leaves of their own. They attach to the roots of their so-called host plants, and they siphon off the sap and then eventually produce these rather lavish flowering structures. They're quite beautiful in their own way. How does a vampire evolve? Well, let's look at a few more examples. Interesting plants. This one that looks a bit like spaghetti is dodder, and it's a bit of a lasso of a plant. It sends out these tendrils that lasso green plants. You can see this poor one in the middle that it's smothering, and it strangles it and produces these plugs called horstoria, which are a physiological bridge between the parasite and the host, and it sucks its sap through those plugs. It really is quite menacing. But what could be better than this whopping great vegetable vampire, Rafflesia, coming in at a humongous 1.5 meters across? It's the single largest flower on Earth. It's quite extraordinary. It grows in the rainforests of Southeast Asia, this one in Sumatra particularly, and it produces these giant cabbage-like buds that you can see on the left that eventually unfurl into these huge whopping great flowers. It really is quite extraordinary. And why is it a vampire? Well, like the plants we saw just now, it steals all of its food. It doesn't manufacture its own. You can see the vines that I've painted around the Rafflesia. These are the host plant that it feeds from. Very little is known, I should say, about the biology of this vegetable vampire, but it lives inside the tissues of its host as a form of fibres, if you like. Undetected by its host plant, you can think of it as sort of silently stealing its electricity from the grid, undetected. And then eventually it sends forth these enormous buds, many of which die actually, quite a high percentage of them never open, but those that do produce these magnificent flowers. It's very rare, and you're very lucky if you find one. And perhaps that's part of the reason it produces these giant flowers. It's really important because it flowers so erratically that it attracts pollinators, and in this case it attracts flies. So it smells pretty horrific, and it looks a bit like a rotting carcass, and indeed that's what it's pretending to be. So it fools flies into thinking that this is a dead animal, and the flies are the pollinating agents. And again, that might be why it's so large, to broadcast its terrible smell far and wide. And if you're a fly, you'll want to lay your eggs on the biggest dead animal available so that your maggots have a large resource to feed on. So none of this is very pretty. Here's a painting I completed recently of another species, Rafflesia keithii, which grows in the north of Borneo. And I was very lucky to find this at the base of Mount Kinabalu, a very special mountain, which I'll say a bit more about in a moment. Extraordinary plants. This is actually a relative of Rafflesia. This is called Rhizanthes, and I think it would look more at home on the sea floor than it would the rainforest floor. It also grows in Southeast Asia, and like Rafflesia, it feeds on relatives of the grapevine, tropical tetrastigma vines they're called. Very little is known about these extraordinary plant parasites. They really, really are strange and elusive. It's now known through DNA barcoding techniques that these strange plants are actually related to euphorbias. So for a long time it wasn't known what the nearest relatives of these plants were, because they look so different from their photosynthetic relatives. But as I say, DNA sequencing technology has really shed light on the relatives of these plants. So they sit in a wider group that includes violets, poinsettias, passion flowers, and various other things that you just wouldn't expect they were related to. Next in our lineup is Mitrostemon, a very peculiar plant, little known and seldom seen. There are two species, an Old World and a New World one. And I actually looked for this in the rainforests of Okinawa in southern Japan, but without much luck. They're very difficult to find. My painting makes it look a little bit larger than it is. It's probably about the size of your little finger, and sometimes they barely even emerge above the leaf litter of the rainforest floor. Very strange parasitic plant that is distantly related to heathers, so it's in the related to the Ericaceae. Very, very strange. But what could be weirder than this? I had to put this on the front cover of the book Weird Plants, and I mean, just look at it. It's just extraordinary. So this is Hydnora africana. It looks like a mouth, gaping mouth emerging from the ground. And I promise I haven't exaggerated. This is indeed what it looks like, and it grows in southern Africa. I think on my next slide, here we go, you can see it growing in the desert. My painting makes it look a little bit larger perhaps than it is. Forgive me for that. It's probably about half the length of your arm, something like that. And I remember picking my way across the dry, stony desert among the tortoises in southern Africa on a particularly hot day with these giant ants all around me. And then eventually, imagine my surprise when I came across a glade of euphorbias, that desert shrub you can see in the background. And they're all around me with these little gaping mouths poking through the ground. A really, truly extraordinary plant. This one, like Rafflesia, smells horrible, only this time it mimics animal dung, because it's pollinated by beetles which feed on feces, and so they fall into the flower where they pick up and deliver pollen. This is another unusual plant, clearly, often called the Maltese fungus. In fact, it's not a fungus at all. It is a plant, and it's distantly related to saxifrages, which are plants that we grow in our gardens. A very unusual thing. It was highly prized long ago by Maltese knights, and it still grows today on a cliff off the coast of Malta on an island called Gozo, on a rock there, a cliff called Fungus Rock, named after this very plant. It was believed it was a fungus. It was highly prized, and it has been for a long time, and it's long been used in herbal and traditional medicine. I won't dwell on why, but let's just say it's linked to its highly suggestive form. And this is Balanophora, another one of these unusual parasitic plants that grows in the depths of the jungles, and it's very, very difficult to find, very, very unusual. And as you can see, like the other vampires that we've seen, it lacks ordinary leaves and chlorophyll because it steals all of its food by siphoning off its sap from the roots of other plants. Now I'd like to move on to the real killers, the plants that have evolved an arsenal of different traps and snares to attract, entice, kill and digest animal prey. So these are the plants that have really turned the tables on animals. And I love these plants because often when we think about plants, we think of them as inanimate plants that are there for our own enjoyment, and they may be beautiful and things that we grow in our houses and gardens. And I love these plants because they really challenge that perception. So during an era where perhaps fewer people are interested than ever before in the science and biology of plants, particularly at school, here is a group of plants that can really intrigue and fascinate across the generations. Let's start off with a relatively simple one. So this is a Amphora, often called a sun pitcher plant, and it grows on tepuis, these rocky outcrops in the rainforests of South America. And these giant rocky cliffs stand proud of the rainforest below. And because they're so high up, it rains every day. It's a really bleak, bleak place. And because it rains every day, it leaches the soil of all its minerals and nutrients. So all of the phosphorus and the nitrogen and the other things that plants need to grow well have been leached out of the soil. So it's a pretty difficult and hostile place for a plant to grow. And so these pitcher plants have evolved there, in which leaves, quite simply, have folded and become fused along that front edge you can see to form a foliar tube. And in that tube, water collects, and there's no shortage of that on these tepuis. The rainwater collects, and any debris that falls in the form of dead leaves and so on, breaks down, and with the help of bacteria, it forms a nutritious soup. And any insects that are attracted to the nectar that the plant produces, a sugary sweet substance, these will tumble into this leafy abyss in these digestive juices where they're broken down and release nutrients for the plant as well. So here is a very simple plant predator, and in a minute we're going to see some much more elaborate ones. Next up is Sarracenia flava, the trumpet pitcher, which is a relative of the one we saw before, but it's a little bit more complicated. So it's a North American native, and again it produces these foliar tubes that contain digestive enzymes. This one's a little bit more sneaky, in fact, because the nectar that it produces to attract insects is laced with a paralyzing narcotic. So scientists have isolated conine, a drug that's in the nectar, and it means that the insects feeding on this become drowsy and uncoordinated, and they're likely to lose their footing and tumble into the pool of digestive juices below to their doom and to the benefit of the plant. Wow, I love these killer plants. But now let's move on to something even more elaborate, and I'd like to introduce this one, Lowe's pitcher plants. This is an extraordinary plant, and I'd really like to emphasize at this point that a lot of the biology of these plants has only really been understood quite recently. This isn't something that we've known about for a long time. So I'll describe what happens here. This pitcher plant, you can see, looks a little different to the other pitcher plants, and it's shaped somewhat like a toilet, and that's no coincidence. So this grows on a mountain, or a few mountains actually, in North Borneo, where insects, which most pitcher plants feed on, are relatively scarce. And instead, it's attractive to small squirrel-like mammals called tree shrews. And these tree shrews climb onto the pitcher, and they feed on the sweet substance that's produced on the spoon-like lid at the top. And as they feed on this, they defecate into the pitcher. So they basically produce a dollop of nutrient-rich manure to the benefit of the plant. Here's another painting I've done of one. You can see a fat little tree shrew mounting its leafy toilet here. So as I say, it feeds on the white substance produced by the spoon-like structure at the top, and then it defecates into the pitcher. So this is an ingenious means of obtaining nutrients for both the animal and the plant in an environment where nitrogen and phosphorus are scarce. So the plant needs to compete, and it needs to find a new means of getting nutrients to produce these energetically expensive pitchers, and the animal benefits in a resource-limited environment from feeding on sugary nectar. So it's a win-win situation here. This is one of my favourite of all plants. This is the king pitcher plant, a giant among pitcher plants. And you know, I had this lifelong ambition to see this plant. And I remember standing on a misty mountainside in North Borneo on Mount Kinabalu, which is the only mountain incidentally where this plant actually grows, seeing a grove of these monster plants. And they really are extraordinary because these pitchers grow to about 1 foot long. They're absolutely huge. And For a long time, it was unknown why a plant like this would produce such enormous pitchers if all they trap is insects. Because as I say, these pitchers are relatively expensive for the plant to produce in energetic terms. And so if you're going to produce something like this, you want to be really sure that you can compete with the surrounding vegetation. And it was actually discovered recently that just like Lowe's pitcher plant that we saw a moment ago, this one also acts as a tree shrew toilet. So the animals clamber onto the pitcher, they feed on the sweet nectar on that spoon-like lid at the top, and as they cling onto the pitcher, they defecate into it and provide it with nutrient-rich manure. So it really is. Here's another painting of one I produced just recently to try and show the plant in all its splendour on the slopes of Mount Kinabalu. Actually, I've had a lifelong fascination with this mountain in the north of Borneo because it's a pitcher plant paradise. It's a place that's just dripping with epiphytic orchids and Rafflesia grows at the base of the mountain. It's just extraordinary. It's a wonderful place. This is a Villos pitcher plant that I saw growing among some orchids on the mountain. And here are two other plants that I've painted based on my trips up and down the slopes of that mountain. The one on the left is a porcelain pitcher plant, the Anthes burbigii, and the one on the right is a hybrid pitcher plant. They really are wonderful, the plants that grow on these misty mountainsides. I want to move on to a predator that we're all very familiar with. So this, of course, needs no introduction. It's the Venus flytrap, and it produces these barbed leafy snares that sit in wait of prey, typically insects, but occasionally something larger, as you can see. And if the technology permits, I'd just like to show a little video I took on my iPhone just recently of one growing in our botanic garden. And what you'll notice if you look carefully where my arrow is, if you can see that, are three little trigger hairs on the surface of the purple area. So not the fringe of spines, but three little inconspicuous hairs in the middle. These are trigger hairs. And if you touch them once, nothing happens. But if you touch them again in quick succession, a threshold is reached and it generates a response rather like a human nerve in some ways that causes the lobes to change in shape, and they effectively collapse in on themselves, and that's what causes the lobes to trap, and they will incarcerate any poor hapless insect that happens to have walked over their surface. So if ever there was a killer among, I think that is one. Now I'm going to move on to some of the fraudsters. So these are the plants that are the decoys of the plant kingdom. So plants that pretend to be something they're not. This one people think I've invented, and I really haven't. It's called Psychotria elata. It's a member of the coffee family, and this is the calyx, the sort of leafy bracts that the flowers emerge through, and it just happens to our eyes to look remarkably like a pair of lips. This is Rothschild Orchid, back on our favourite mountain, Mount Kinabalu in Borneo. And if you look carefully at the lateral sepals, you'll see those stripes are broken up into little sort of purplish dots. Now, parasitic wasps that are looking for a place to lay their eggs mistake these for a brood of blackfly or aphids, because that's what her larvae feed on. And as she investigates what she thinks is a colony of juicy blackfly, she may inadvertently fall into that shiny pouch at the front. And if she does that, the only means of escape she has is to crawl via a little tunnel at the back of the flower. And as she does so, it's just about large enough for her to squeeze her way through, and then a big dollop of pollen becomes glued to her back. And so she leaves these flowers rather bewildered, and the chances are she may do the same thing again, and this time she'll deliver pollen, and the orchid has done its job. She's cross-pollinated it. This rather unusual looking flower is sometimes called a toad cactus. It's not actually a cactus at all. It is a succulent though, and it grows in southern Africa. It has a very unusual flower that smells really, really bad, rather like the Rafflesia we saw earlier, but much smaller, of course. And if you're going to flower in the driest deserts, there may be fewer bees around to fulfill your pollination needs, and so that's why plants have sometimes evolved these means of attracting flies as pollinators. It's a process called sapromyophily, and it basically means flowers that resemble rotting meat to attract flies as pollinators, and it's evolved several times in the plant. And here is a relative called the Starfish Flower. It's another Stapelia, and it grows around southern Africa and Namibia. And its flowers are replete with a sort of pelt of fur or even mould, it may be, just to really perfect the mimicry of a dead animal to attract these pollinating flies. It's really pretty gruesome. Now I'd like to show you something really quite amazing, and again, people think that my painting has exaggerated the form of this, but I promise if you look this one up on the internet, you'll see I haven't. This is the flying duck orchid, and it grows in parts of Australia, and it produces these incredible flowers that really do look like a duck in flight, and there's no particular reason for that, it just happens to our eyes. Nevertheless, it does have a very complicated means of reproduction. So, its flowers emerge at the same time as a particular species of sawfly, and during the breeding season, the male sawflies look for a female, and the females will emit a pheromone, a chemical signal, to tell the males that they are there and that they're ready to mate. And typically the male sawfly would locate one of these females, and she's wingless, so he flies off, mates with her, and then they reproduce. Now this is an orchid that has interrupted the mating cycle of this particular insect. It produces a bogus fake pheromone that smells exactly like that the female insect produces, and the male sawfly is completely fooled by this. So he locates the flower thinking that he's found a seductive female of the same species, and he tries to mate with what he thinks is this female. And so he clings on to what we perceive to be the head of the duck here. And as he clings on, he tries to fly away with her, only the hinge, which is the neck of the duck, is flexible, and every time he thrusts and tries to fly away, he's flung headfirst into the reproductive parts of the flower, which are concealed between the two wings, the sepals of the flying duck orchids. It's quite extraordinary, and he's repeatedly headflung into those reproductive parts where he picks up and delivers pollen. So here is a flower that really manipulates these poor sex-crazed male insects. This is a monkeyface orchid. Again, it just happens to look remarkably like a monkey's face to our eyes, but there's no reason for that mimicry particularly. I'm now going to talk about some jailers. So these are the plants that imprison insects. And this is a dead horse arum, and it smells again like rotting flesh. There's a theme here. It grows on beautiful islands in the Mediterranean, such as Majorca and Sardinia, and it's attractive to bluebottle flies because it grows among gull colonies. And these flies are actually imprisoned overnight in the floral chamber, the green pouch on the right, by a series of downward pointing spines. And after 24 hours, the spines wither and release the flies, and they go off and do the same thing again. So they are imprisoned into their pollination circuit. These are birthworts, also known as Dutchmans pipes. This particular one is often called a pelican flower, and much in the same way as the dead horse arum that we've just seen, this is another trap pollinator. So the flowers produce an unpleasant smell that's attractive to flies. They crawl into a floral chamber, that pouch-like structure at the back, where they become held hostage by the plant. They're imprisoned, they're showered with pollen overnight, and then they're released the following day, and they may go and do the same thing with another flower, therefore cross-pollinating the plant. Here are some more Dutchman's pipes. They're very peculiar looking. Some of the most extraordinary flowers I know. This is also a Dutchman's pipe, a species called Aristolochia arborea, and it produces this peculiar mushroom or toadstool-like structure in the center of the flower structure. This is indeed a bogus mushroom, and it's particularly attractive to fungus gnats that typically lay their eggs and breed on fungi in the rainforest. And that's what they think this is. It looks and smells like a mushroom, and it bamboozles them. They really think that that's what it is. So this is a form of pollination by deception, this perfect mimicry that fools insects, dupes them into thinking that the flower is something that it isn't, all for the plant's gain and not for the insects. It's very duplicitous. It offers no form of reward in the form of sugary nectar, for example. Now let's take a look at the accomplices. So these are the plants that work a little bit more collaboratively with animals. This is a bucket orchid. How is it collaborative? Well, it produces a sort of perfume that a particular species of male bee harvests and uses to attract females. And the orchid expects something in return for producing this unique brand of bee body spray. And so it sends these unfortunate male bees on a sort of pollination obstacle course. So as they teem around the flower, some may fall into that bucket-like structure, which is filled with fluid. And the only way out is a little passageway at the back, rather like we saw in Rothschild Orchid earlier. And they become saddled with pollen as they go. And these bewildered bees emerge wet and bedraggled from the bucket orchid. And if they go and do the same thing on another bucket orchid, well, they bring about cross-pollination for the plant. This really peculiar looking one is called an ant plant, and it lives high up in the treetops as an epiphyte, which means that it lives on the branches of other trees, but it doesn't steal food from the trees in the same way that the vampire plants did that we saw earlier. This one has a very swollen stem, as you can see. It's called a domation, and it's filled with a labyrinth of hollow chambers. Ants make their nest inside these chambers, and it's a wonderful form of cooperation between the plant and the ants, and here's how. So anyone who's ever disturbed an ant's nest will know that they don't like it, and they will voraciously attack anything that threatens their colony. And this works very much to the advantage of the plant, because any would-be predator that tries to attack or feed on the plant is voraciously attacked by the ants that it houses. The ants also bring in various bits of detritus that decompose and break down and provide food for the plant as well. So in return for the investment of this labyrinth, this bespoke accommodation that the plant produces for ant colonies, it has this army of ants that patrol its stems and defend the plant from attack. And interestingly, even one particular species of pitcher plant has actually evolved a similar mutualism. So this is Nepenthes bicalcarata, or the fanged pitcher plant, and it also has ants living within its hollow tendrils. And I read a wonderful report of an ant here that actually took a would-be predator of the pitcher plant and threw it into the pitcher to the benefit of the plant, which I thought was quite interesting. And this species has bats that live inside its pitchers. So rather like the tree shrews that we saw earlier, these bats make their home inside the pitcher. They roost, and it's a safe place for them to rear their young. And of course they urinate and defecate into the pitcher. So much like the example we saw earlier, this provides nutrients for the plant. I want to mention survivors because plants, as I say, turn the tables on animals in terms of their survival. Welwitschia here is a gymnosperm, so it's related to conifers, and it just sits out in the deserts, potentially for millennia. It really is extraordinary. Animals can survive for as long. This is another succulent that grows in Namibia, sometimes called half-mens. People thought they looked like silhouettes of people in the desert. And you can see it stores water in its giant distended trunk. And this one, it just produces a few little leaves at the top, and if conditions become really bad, it just sheds them and waits for the next rainfall before it grows them again. Other plants have sort of boom and bust techniques, so they sit in the form of seeds lying dormant in the desert until the rains come, and then they grow very, very quickly, such as this desert pea, which reproduces sometimes in a matter of weeks. And the final group I want to talk about are the hitchhikers. So how do plants get from A to B? And I want to talk about a durian. I don't know if you've ever tried this. There are normally a few people in the audience who have. It's a real delicacy in Southeast Asia. And I can't say I like the fruit myself. It tastes a little bit like custard, but the fruit produces this really overpowering smell that's a bit like drains. It smells pretty grim, so much so that you're actually banned from traveling with these on certain airlines and in buses and in hotels in Southeast Asia. It's a smell that really permeates and lingers long after the fruit has gone. The reason it produces this smell is very distinctive. And so for animals in the rainforest, they know exactly when one of these has come into season because they can smell it from far and wide. And then they feed on the very nutritious yellow pulp inside the fruit, and then they carry the seeds for long distances, particularly birds, because they fly all over the rainforest. And then they deposit the seeds in a packet of manure, which of course is just to the benefit of the plant. So it has its own sort of courier service. Oh, this was me recently giving a lecture in Cambridge, and I took a durian to show people, and then I had to share a room with it that evening, and I really didn't enjoy the experience. Oh, I wanted to show a snake gourd just because I really wanted to paint this because it just looks so much like a snake. I love this particular fruit. It's really strange. And in some parts of the world, people tether a brick to the bottom so that it can grow long and straight, and it really does grow long. But I prefer it in its natural form like this. One of the final things I wanted to show was this very beautiful seed, and I took a long time choosing just the right shade of blue to get this right, to show just how vibrant it is and to explain why it's this very beautiful colour. So it's related to the bird of paradise plant which grows in southern Africa. And these plants produce seeds with red appendages, which are attractive to birds because birds see very well in red. But this one, the traveller's palm, grows in Madagascar, where birds are few but mammals are more. And this is particularly attractive to lemurs because lemurs see very well in the blue and green spectrum. And so this is a seed that is attractive to lemurs because they can feed on this blue part. So it's signposting that the seed is ripe and ready for collection by these lemurs. And the last plant that I wanted to talk about is a little bit more sad, really, and it's this one called Nepenthes extincta. Now, this is a plant that only exists now in the form of a dried, pressed specimen in the herbarium at Kew. It was collected in Mindanao in the Philippines, and where it grew is now one of the world's largest nickel mining sites. Which is so sad because all there is left of this plant is my painting that I've tried to recreate here and the herbarium specimen. And some of the stories that I've told today about the various contrivances by which these plants interact with animals, we'll never know those for this plant because it's been lost forever. And sadly, that's the case for many plants. And really, that comes down to the hope in creating this odd assemblage of sort of weird botanical oddities was I really wanted to inspire people with the wonders of the plant world and to show people that plants are fascinating just as much as animals and they're really worth conserving. And so I hope that, that I can help inspire a new generation of botanists to go out there, explore and conserve these wonderful plants for many generations to enjoy to come. Thank you.